Welcome everybody to a Guilds of Ravnica draft primer. Thought I'd just throw some thoughts out there for those looking to draft the set. Come back to Arena this week. Guilds of Ravnica, if you have not played it before, is a very classic Ravnica experience where I've got 5 of the 10 guilds, the 2-color pairs. So I figured I'd just go through all 5 of those guilds, just talk about some thoughts on each of them, roughly ranking them from best guilds to the less good guilds. And we're gonna start here with Boros. So Boros was definitely the best deck in my mind. There was Dimir, which is I think the second best deck. That was pretty close to it. It's not just a landslide, but if I could have my pick of deck going into a Guilds of Ravnica draft, I would choose to draft Boros. So let's go over it. So the mechanic for Boros is Mentor. Pretty good aggressive mechanic. Whenever this creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with lesser power. Really what you want out of an aggressive mechanic, helps your smaller creatures be relevant as the game goes on. Mentor, like anything that puts +1/+1 counters on it, tends to play well with keywords. So something like Fresh Face Recruit, a 2/1 that can get first strike in your turn. But honestly, just like a 2-mana 2/2, just a 10th District Guard 2-mana 2/2 comes in and gives something +0/+1. Extremely minor effect, but a fine card to put in your deck if you've got enough of the Mentor cards. However, the best thing for your Mentor decks, the best common for these decks, and I think just best common overall in the set, is Healer's Hawk. 1-mana 1/1 flying lifelink. You get one counter on this, it becomes a huge problem, and often you can get more than one counter on it. It's just the card that you don't want to see your opponent play on turn 1. So I would just draft as many Healer's Hawks as I possibly could, honestly. But let's go through the gold cards first. I think that's what we're going to do for all these guilds, just to give you a good idea what's going on. So Boros Challenger, the 2-drop I just talked about a second ago, I think this is probably the best of them. It's a 2-mana 2/3, which is really important. One of the things with your Mentor creatures is if you can get them in twice, that's great, right? If you can get 2 counters on smaller things, you've really done it. And of course, not only is this a 2/3, which makes it a little bit harder to block early, but as the game goes on, you've got the threat of activation of pumping it. Oftentimes, you'll just pump this before you actually attack, make it a 3/4, pump up your 2/2. You can imagine the curve of like Healer's Hawk into Boros Challenger being pretty good. We've got a cycle of Guild Mages in this set, 2-mana 2/2s that have 2 abilities. So Legion Guild Mage is a solid one. It's got some burn in the 6-mana ability. The tap ability, also pretty nice. We also have a cycle of these like red, white, or blue, black, CCDD cards, what we called them back in the day, that are really powerful, but really hard to cast. This is what I mean when I say you're really incentivized to be 2 colors in this set a little more often than some other Ravnica sets, because if you're not exactly 2 colors, these cards are very tough to cast. But for example, Truefire Paladin, excellent card. It's a 4-power Mentor creature. Your opponents really don't want to block this because they'll take a bunch of damage, and that's one of the things with Mentor creatures. Your opponents are often incentivized to trade those off, which means that these Mentor creatures play very well with combat tricks, even more so than in a normal aggro deck. Sky Knight Legionnaire, this is kind of funny because every time we've been to Ravnica, like the 3 main times we've been there, Sky Knight Legionnaire has been printed, and there's good reason. It's just a good card. 3 mana for a 2/2 flying haste, and of course this gets mentored very well too. Hammer Dropper, a fine one, 4 mana 5/2 mentor. It's gonna get in 1 hit most likely, but if you can get in 2, that's pretty good. Some cards to avoid: Garrison Sergeant, just, you know, not really great. You're really not looking for these expensive cards in your Boros decks. Same with Swath Cutter Giant. This one's a little more acceptable because it does have a pretty big impact, but it's not a card I think you should really prioritize. Then just looking at some of the monocolor cards here, so we have 2 Mentor cards at common for each color, 2 red, 2 white. The best of the bunch here is Wojak Bodyguard, 3 mana 3/3 Mentor, can't attack or block alone. This set came out in 2019, so when the power level was a little bit lower, and 3 mana 3/3 was, you know, a pretty respectable stat line. We don't really look at 3 mana 3/3 and think anything special of it anymore, but 3 mana 3/3 that puts a counter on something when it attacks, like that's pretty strong. We've also got Barging Sergeant as a big hasty thing, Parhelion Patrol as an evasive thing, Blade Instructor, another one that's going to kind of like get in once and then trade off, but totally fine. Some premium ones that are uncommon: Sunhome Stalwart, 2 mana 2/2 First Strike Mentor. So again, really difficult to block, often gets in multiple times. And Goblin Banneret, so 1 mana 1/1 Mentor that you can pay 2 mana to give it +2/+0. Remember, you're most likely going to want to do this before you actually go to attack, so you actually get to mentor a small creature. And then this deck really didn't need it, but we've got Cosmotronic Wave, which is a card you might be familiar with if you played Phyrexia Obi-Wan, where we had Hazardous Blast. It's just that card. Really strong, aggressive finisher. You're gonna want to copy these in each of your Boros decks. Oh, also, one thing I forgot to mention, there's also a cycle of split cards. Integrity Intervention, for an example here. Half of it is a combat trick, half of it is a 4 mana lightning helix, and most of these for each of the guilds are pretty good. All right, now it's time for Dimir, and Dimir's mechanic is one that has just become evergreen in Magic. It's Surveil. We know Surveil quite well at this point, but it does have a few cards that key off of when you Surveil, so payoffs. Dimir is just like your classic control deck, or it's going to be drawing a bunch of cards, removing all your opponent's stuff, winning by maybe just outcarding them. Winning with something like Nightveil Predator, which is a super obnoxious card. It's blue, black for a 3/3 flying death touch hexproof, incredibly hard to deal with. We also get Disinformation Campaign, which looks a lot like Intimidation Campaign. You know, that card was modeled off of this one, but this one's better because what you lose out in gaining a life and making them lose a life, your opponent has to discard a card. So just casting this card once is okay, and often you get to pick this card up 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Like, your opponent gets empty-handed pretty quickly, and then you just keep drawing cards and start grinding out the game. So this is a really great engine card. Nightveil Predator is like a better standalone card. It doesn't need any work, but as an engine, Campaign is just as good. Then we've got Dimir Spybug, another pretty good one here. 2-mana 1/1 Flying Menace. Then whenever you surveil, put a +1/+1 counter on the Spybug. Gets pretty big pretty quickly. Thought Erasure as sort of a Thoughtseize variant that surveils. And Dimir's gold commons are all pretty good. So the best of the bunch here is Artful Takedown. This is a 4-mana instant that you can choose one or both. Tap target creature, or something gets -2, -4 until end of turn. So just a really good removal spell. Kills most things, helps keep you alive by tapping down one of your opponent's things. This is like exactly what you want against the Boros deck, to like kill their best thing, tap down their next thing, don't take any damage this turn. Darkblade Agent is a pretty good one here. 3-mana 2/3 that if you've surveilled this turn, it gains death touch, and when it hits your opponent, you draw a card. So it's hard for your opponent to play around. They want to block it because they don't want you to draw a card, but then if they block it, it gains death touch, and it's a 2/3, so it's a little bit tricky. They often have to block it with like a 3/3 to be able to kill it profitably. Notion Rain here, 3-mana, surveil 2, draw 2 cards, and it deals 2 damage to you. Just a fine card advantage spell. And then one I want to call out here is Whisper Agent. This is 1 Dimir Hybrid for a 3/2 flash. I'm going to ETB surveil 1. Doesn't look like anything special, honestly, but being a instant speed creature, something that you can cast to hold up your mana, block, a surveil trigger, it's a lot better than it looks. This was one of the big gainers as the format went up. People really caught on, oh, okay, Whisper Agent is actually pretty good, because this is a deck, for the most part, that you play at instant speed. Not entirely, of course. We've listed a lot of sorcery speed cards, but once you've kind of got your threats down, your Spybug, and you've cast Campaign a few times, you're just going to pass a turn with a bunch of mana up, so you can cast a counter spell, cast a removal spell, whatever you need, and Whisper Agent just kind of fills that role of, being able to cast it in a turn if your opponent doesn't do anything you want to react to. Pumps your Spybug in combat, for example, triggers your Darkblade Agent in combat at instant speed. We've got Deadweight as a good removal spell, single black mana for an aura, gives something -2, -2, and sometimes we've seen Deadweight and it's been fine, or even kind of like underwhelming sometimes. In this set, it's really good. Like, there's just a lot of small creatures. You kill 3 drops with this a lot of the time. This one's a premium common in this set. We also got Murmuring Mystic, which is a really busted uncommon here. This is a 4-mana 1/5. Then whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you make a blue 1/1 flyer creature token. So this is also sort of like for the Izzet deck, but it plays very well in the Dimir deck as well. Blocks incredibly well, and your opponent just has to deal with this, or else you're just going to take over the game with this just by itself. We've got Deadly Visit as a removal spell that surveils. Watcher in the Mist is a pretty good creature that surveils. Nightveil Sprite is a cheap, good threat that surveils consistently. This is like one of the best cheap cards for the deck. And here's the thing, if you don't get the Nightveil Predator or the Disinformation Campaign, or maybe a good rare, one of the classic ways to win in this deck is just, in true control deck fashion, is Devious Cover-Up. So this is a 4-mana counterspell that if a spell was countered this way, exile it instead of putting it in its owner's graveyard, and then you may shuffle up to 4 target cards from your graveyard into the library. So what you would do is you have 2 copies of these, and you just loop them so you never deck. You just cast all your removal spells, your card draw spells again, have your opponent deck eventually, and it's nice to have an easy I win button like Predator or Mystic. But Devious Cover-Up, it's a card that nobody really takes very highly. You can get them pretty late, and just having 2 copies of these plus a bunch of removal is a pretty good plan. So Boros and Dimir, those are kind of like the tier 1 decks, and then we move to Izzet, which is like tier 1.5, tier 2-ish, I would say. Less good, but still definitely a pretty good deck. Was my favorite deck back in the day to draft. So Izzet's got the Jumpstart mechanic. You're going to find this on spells, and it says you can cast this card from your graveyard by discarding a card in addition to paying its other costs. Then you exile this card. So a little bit weird when you first read it, but it's sort of like Flashback, except you don't get any card advantage like you would in Flashback. You have to actually discard something else. And the idea behind it is this is a mechanic that allows you to cast more spells to get more spells triggers for stuff like your Murmuring Mystic, right? Like, one of the fundamental tensions in your limited blue-red spells deck sometimes is like having that balance of creature payoffs and spells in your deck. Obviously, you want a lot of spells, but you also need some creatures generally. And this is sort of a solve to that problem, where you can discard a land, and that becomes, like, quote-unquote, becomes another spell you cast, or discard one of your creatures. There's 2 variants of this deck. So one is a control variant, sort of like Dimir, but with red cards instead. Often you're going to want to draft that if you open Niv Mizzet Power In, which is one of the best rares in the set. Just incredibly powerful card. Worth noting, if you have this card, you're going to want to prioritize the Izzet Guild Gates a little bit higher, because blue, 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 red, red, red is tough to cast, even in a 2-color deck. Like if your mana base is just 9-8, sometimes you're just not going to cast this card till turn 7, 8, 9. But yeah, this card is absurd. Also, Murmuring Mystic, another good reason to draft this as a little bit more of a controlling deck. But both these cards, you know, you can definitely fit in your more tempo-y, hit you for a million damage in one turn kind of deck, which is the, I think, other more common version of how you're going to play this deck. So you've got something like Piston Fist Cyclops, which is a 3-mana 4/3 defender, but when you cast a spell, it can attack as though it didn't have defender. You've got Wee Dragonauts as a different version of that, so it's a 3-mana 1/3 flyer. Whenever you cast a spell, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Constructed staple, Crackling Drake is in this set, which is just a fantastic card. Gets gigantic based on the number of spells, not just in your graveyard, but also in exile, so you can still exile your jumpstart cards and it doesn't make your Drake any smaller. Thing just hits super, super hard. Beacon Bolt as a good removal spell, and then this is kind of a weird one, Sonic Assault. So this is definitely for the aggressive version of the deck, not really for the controlling version, but this is a 3-mana instant that taps target creature and deals 2 damage to that creature's controller. Then on turn 4 or turn 5, you go Sonic Assault, tap your thing, get him for 6, deal you damage with the Sonic Assault. Next turn I get to do it again by jump starting something else. Maybe you burn them with a direct current. So it's sort of like a burn deck in some ways. You're really just trying to like figure out the math of like, okay, well, they're at 12. How many spells do I have to cast here? How many can I induce them into like a sort of bad attack so like I can tap down their 1 blocker with the Sonic Assault they don't see coming, get them for that last hit. We've also got Hypothesis as a great removal spell, something we saw in Thunder Junction. We've got Goblin and Electromancer as a fine 2-drop. And I guess one kind of trap to call out here is Fire Urchin. This is a 2-mana 1/3 trample. So whenever you cast instant or sorcery, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Just not a very good card. Like, you could play it if you were short on 2s, but don't look at this as like, ooh, this is the 2-drop for my blue-red deck. It's just a little anemic, you know, just doesn't hit as hard as you'd like it to. Just not a card I think you need to prioritize. Okay, now we move on to the green decks, Golgari and Selesnya. And green is really bad at common in this set. The mono green commons really, really struggle. One of the better ones is Crawl Forager. This is a 5-mana 4/4 with Undergrowth, which is the Golgari ability. It says, when Crawl Foragers enter the battlefield, you gain 1 life for each creature in the graveyard, and that's what Golgari is doing. It's like, okay, count the number of creatures in your graveyard, you get some effect based on how many creatures you have in the graveyard. And one of the problems with this mechanic is it's not very well supported. Like, you'd think there'd be a lot of self-mill to fill up your grave. They were very, very, very conservative with that. I think there's only like 1 or 2 cards that self-mill. Really, you're just supposed to get cards in your graveyard by like creature combat, just cards going to the graveyard naturally. So really temper your expectations when you see these Undergrowth triggers and be like, oh, it could be massive. Generally, it's going to be a bit smaller than you expect. And for quite a while, when this set first came out, Golgari was pegged as the worst deck in the format. I don't think that's the case. I actually think that honor goes to Selesnya. Golgari's got a lot of good gold cards at higher rarities. Its common gold cards are actually kind of laughable. We'll get to those. But we've got Izoni, really strong card, just makes a bunch of tokens if you can set it up. Draws you a bunch of cards. We've got Find Finality, split card of buy 2 things back from the yard, or a field wipe that grows your biggest thing and keeps it around, or maybe grows your second biggest thing and you get to keep 2 things around, wipe your opponent's board. So these are definitely good reasons to draft Golgari. We've got Underrealm Lich, which is a solid one. Vraska, Golgari Queen, a solid planeswalker. The black, green uncommon here, Golgari Finebroker. This is really good. 3/4 that comes in, returns a permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. This is another good reason to draft Golgari. So we've got some power here, but like I mentioned, the gold cards at common are really kind of, you know, we got Erstwald Trooper. So 1 black-green for a 2/2. All right, already started not great. Discard a creature card. Erstwald Trooper gets +2/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. Activate only once each turn. So I guess this is a way to enable your Undergrowth, but like at what cost? What happens with this is like you attack with this on turn 3 and your opponent's like, all right, I take it, you know, like who cares? Or worst case, you attack into their 3/3 and you're like, great, I'll activate this, discard a card, and they just have an interaction spell. It's just such a disaster. We've also got Undercity Uprising as an incredibly poor removal spell. 4 mana for a sorcery. Creatures you control gain Death Touch until end turn. And target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. So it's a 4 mana fight spell. Obviously, you're going to kill the creature that you target because your thing has Death Touch, but just extremely inefficiently costed. We've got Rhizome Lurcher. This one can be okay. This is a 4 mana 2/2 that gets a +1/+1 counter, equal number of creatures in your graveyard when you cast it. So that one's actually not too bad, although you still have to put in a little work to make this a passable card. We've got a few decent uncommons here. Arcane Assassin, 3 mana, 1/1 Death Touch. All creatures have to block the assassin. So if you can pump this somehow, you can kind of engineer it as a board wipe. Swarm Guildmage is a pretty good Guildmage. So we've definitely got some good cards in here, right? It's just not the commons that are pulling any weight. I will say that the Crawl Foragers, that's a pretty good one. Vigor Spore Worm, this is also a solid one. 6 mana, 6/4. The when it enters the battlefield, target creature gains vigilance and gets +X/+X until end of turn, or X the number of creature cards in your graveyard. And then the Vigor Spore Worm can't be blocked by more than one creature. So solid top end card. There's also the rats and cats strategy to fill up your graveyard, where you have Burglar Rat and Generous Stray, both like card advantage generating small creatures, just 2 mana 1/1, your opponent discards a card when it enters, and 3 mana 1/2, you draw a card when it enters. So you want to draft a bunch of those, and then Severed Strands, which is kind of like a Bone Splinters variant. 2 mana, sack a thing, destroy a thing, you gain life equal to the thing you sack toughness. So there's something going on here, for sure, but you do want the higher rarity cards to draft Golgari. Then we get to Selesnya, where its intended mechanic, Convoke, which we've seen a lot, and it has been a good mechanic, just doesn't really work very well here. So they just forgot to put tokens in the set. It's what it feels like. It's almost like Golgari, where it's like, oh, you see Undergrowth and you think Self-Mill. With Selesnya, it's like, oh, you see Convoke and you think about tokens. They have Sworn Companions, which is a 3 mana, make 2 1/1 lifelink tokens. Okay, like, not a great card, and that's kind of it. There's not a lot to enable your Convoke cards. You're just supposed to cast creatures. Healer's Hawk is one of the best things, just as a 1-droplet that can tap for mana, almost like a Llanowar Elf in some degree. The Convoke cards aren't very good, so there's a common one that's solid. Rosebane Centaur, 4 mana, 4/4, Convoke Vigilance, but the rest of them kind of just suck. We've got World Soul Colossus, X green white for a 0/0 Convoke. It enters the battlefield with X+1/+1 counters, so you have to put a lot of mana or tap a lot of creatures to make this any sort of threat. We've got Siege Worm, which was really good back in original Ravnica. 5/5 was just massive, and 5/5 is still fairly big here, but you're paying 5-6 mana for a lot of the time, tapping your team down. Playable, but not really great. Like, if you played back in the day, this Siege Worm in Guilds of Ravnica is not Siege Worm in original Ravnica. There's also Arboreal Elemental, which is a 9 mana, 7/5 Convoke Hexproof. Really expensive, and okay, it's a giant thing, but it just gets chump blocked. Join Shields is one of the golden commons here. 5 mana for an instant, untap all creatures you control. They gain hexproof and indestructible until on turn, so a pretty overcosted effect. And, a microcosm of Convoke not being great is Lev Guardian, one of the commons here. 4 mana for a 2/4 Convoke. Just like the least exciting card in the world. Also kind of baffling Centaur Peacekeeper. Like, ideally, Selesnya is an aggressive deck. But you got Centaur Peacekeeper as one of the gold commons here. 3 mana for a 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, each player gains 4 life. Like, that's just not really something you want. We've got Ledev Champion, which is okay. It's a 3 mana 2/2 uncommon that you can pay 5 mana to make a 1/1 lifelink creature token. And whenever this thing attacks, you tap any number of untapped creatures, and the champion gets +1/+1 till end of turn. So this is an okay uncommon. But just like Golgari, really what you're trying to do, I think, is leverage the high rarity card. So March of the Multitudes is a really strong one. This is X green white for an instant Convoke. You make X 1/1 white creature soldier tokens with lifelink. This card's awesome. We've also got Tristani, big army to can that pumps your other creatures. The green white golden common here, Conclave Cavalier, 4 mana 4/4 vigilance, that when it dies, you make 2/2 night tokens. Like, that card's also pretty good. It also does thankfully get 1 solid golden common here. Samala Woodshaper, 4 mana 2/1. You can then reveal a creature or enchantment from the top 4 cards of your library and put it into your hand. So there's some power here, but really, just like Golgari, even more so than Golgari, because I think there's even fewer good gold cards to get rewarded for. You have to have really good reasons, and honestly, like, you probably just want to splash Tristani or March of the Multitude somewhere. I don't think these are even, like, reasons to be like, okay, now I'm gonna be Selesnya. One thing you can do is kind of treat it just like green-white Boros, like you're using Healer's Hawk and the white mentor creatures and the few decent green cards you picked up, plus the good Selesnya gold cards. Like, that was the most successful way to draft this deck if you didn't have the high rarity cards. But this is definitely the deck I would put the most caution on, because it looks like the cards sort of work together, but they just end up being underpowered. All right, then just quickly, I wanted to call out the Gates deck, which, if you're trying to remember this set, if you played it before and you're like, oh, the Gates deck, I have fond memories of it. This is not the Gate deck from RNA, which was very strong. This Gate deck has way fewer payoffs, and they're not as good. So just to make it explicit, I've been kind of mentioning it, but we do have the 5 guild gates in common here, 1 for each of the guilds. We also have Gateway Plaza, which is quite a bit worse. It's like a double tap land. You have to play it tapped and then pay 1, or else you have to sacrifice it. It adds a mana of any color, but much worse than just the regular gate. And then as far as payoffs go, we've got Glaive of the Guild Pact, which I think is the best of the bunch. This is a 2 mana equipment, equip for 3, The equipped creature gets +1/+0 for each gate you control and has Vigilance and Menace. So this is actually a nice card in that like Golgari cats and rats deck where you have a lot of small creatures, 1/1s, 1/2s. If you have a bunch of gates, you slap this on those creatures. Those things attack. Your opponent has to trade off with them at some point. They go to the graveyard, fill your Undergrowth. There's Guild Summit, which is a kind of clunky card draw spell. I think if you're playing like a blue deck, there's just better ways to draw cards. And there's Gatekeeper Gargoyle. This card's solid too. It's a 6-mana 3/3 flying, enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter for each gate you control. So not a bad card at all. But the gate themes were very, very light. Like you never really ended up being like, I am the Gates deck, because what are your payoffs, right? It's just, you didn't have like the Gatebreaker Rams and the Gates Ablaze and the Colossus. That was the next set. All right, and that's gonna do it. I hope that you do get a chance to draft this set if you're so inclined. Compared to the sets of today, this definitely feels a little bit almost like core setty in a lot of ways. I think the cards are just a little more simple, a little more straightforward. There's not as many like overlapping synergies, but for the week it's out, it's something a bit different to do. All right, happy drafting.